So as a lot of you know, I tend to talk a lot. And that can sometimes lead to the confusion or the mistaken conclusion that it is about a lot of information, and ultimately what I would say about that is that if we look at the content of what I speak a lot about, it's really there to undermine a certain structure that has developed within our system, a structure that is what makes so much noise, so much thought noise. And so ultimately, we could say that it's about being able to come back to silence. So one of the concepts really is telling us that what we're looking for is peace of mind. And the description given is that peace of mind is the absence of, the stopping of a certain movement that is ultimately an uncomfortableness or creates an uncomfortableness within or as part of the experience of life. And so that peace of mind is the removal of that movement of ultimately thought and feeling, specific thought and specific feeling. And so if you ever find that awareness lands on the fact that you are thinking incessantly in a way that can be seen to be uncomfortable, in that maybe it's got a certain yearning, a certain feel like, oh, I have to get something, why haven't I got something in the thinking, then remember, actually, it's about coming back to silence. Now that's easier said than done, until our system gets to a certain point where the structures are not as strong and not as overriding. And then a coming back to the silence starts to be something that is available. Not available to us because the doer can then do that, but the system becomes configured in a way that it has started to, or deeply understand, it's about silence. Silence is peace of mind. And so whenever the thinking mind is in operation, which is just a function of the system, once the system has changed sufficiently that the system understands that what we're really looking for is peace of mind, the end of the thinking mind, the end of a certain type of thinking or feeling that is, we could call or describe as an uncomfortableness with oneself, which really makes the present moment feel uncomfortable and unacceptable. Once the system understands that and it sees a certain narrative that is at play, it may just start coming back to being quiet, which really means one of the principles that allows a system to come back is an understanding this really isn't important. This line of thinking that has taken center stage is really that because it's suffering, because it is the uncomfortableness. And so to be able to cut off line of thought mid-thought, mid-topic, is not something that the system can just do at any point in time, because it's usually the system is thinking about a particular topic. And in this case, I'm talking about like the thinking mind, blaming someone, feeling shame, looking into the future with expectation, thinking that when things turn out a certain way, then I will be happy. Until the system has realized that that is suffering, the system is doing that thinking because it thinks it's very valuable. It thinks that blaming the other, feeling resentment to the other is a significant contributor to a better life. And so it keeps doing it. And we can only cut off a certain line of thinking when we realize this isn't the priority. In fact, when it comes to the thinking mind, not only is it not the priority, but it is what interferes with what is really the priority. Now, coming back to silence requires more than just an appreciation of what suffering is and an appreciation of how habitual suffering is. It also requires the system to be developed in such a way that a platform or a ground of silence opens up such that the center of consciousness can reground in that platform. That platform happens to be the self, the essence of the human being. That's really always there, but the psychological thinking mind, the psychological identity, which is thought-based, conceptual in its nature, meaning it exists in mind, is on a different dimension to the silence or the self. So we could say the self is outside of thought. It is not a thought of who I am, but rather it is an essence. It is what is referred to as consciousness. So until that platform has opened up, even if we hear that the incessant movement of mind is what disturbs our peace of mind, then we might try the only way that stopping can be attempted is a stopping by trying to think the end of thinking, to create the end of thought through a movement of thought, because really that is the way that we've learned to address topics. We either address a topic that is a physical situation, you move from the room to the right side of the room. But when it comes to trying to solve thought problems, we can't pick our thoughts up and move them around or squash them with physical action. And so the only other tool that we know to try and employ in order to quieten the mind is thought. And unfortunately, that is like trying to get out of a hole by digging faster. We might think it's possibly going to be effective, but it turns out to just exacerbate the problem. And so a stopping is maybe more accurately described as a dropping out, a withdrawing of energy from the process of thought. And that withdrawing energy, like if we just hear about that, we'll try to imagine and think what this withdrawing of energy is, and we'll try to withdraw energy through thought. Like, okay, I'm going to withdraw my energy now. And that might be as good as we can get to, because we're trying to think about withdrawing energy. Whereas if this ground opens up, this dimension opens up, that movement from what we could call head to heart is the withdrawing of energy, the recentering of energy from the head, which is the thinking process, into something that is, we could describe it as more real, more less relative, less changing. And there's not many things that are more changing than thought. There aren't many things that are less or more relative than thought. So that's why we can call this dimension of being, or the dimension of consciousness, truer than the dimension of thought. That's understood very simply when we understand the very relative nature of thinking. Once thinking is seen to be and appreciated to be very relative, meaning essentially continually in flux. You can't hold on to a thought and just freeze it. Thought is always moving, always changing. New information comes in and we change our view, we change our opinion. Even in a particular moment without new information, we start thinking about something else. Something moves in front of us, we see something, we hear something, we taste something, and it inspires new thought. We can go from feeling excited to feeling not excited in an instant. And often that is because circumstances changed and we are thinking about the circumstance. So thought on many different levels is very relative. So when we have an identity that is an identity that keeps emerging in ever-changing thought, which include a whole lot of beliefs about who we are and what we need and how life works, what's important, what adds to us, what takes away from us, then the self that is essentially living life is very vulnerable. It's very changeable. It's not consistent. It's one of the reasons why at some point we feel like authenticity and truth is so important, because we've had a whole life of living as this thought-based entity that is essentially inconsistent. And intuitively, we know that that isn't truth, that it isn't the authenticness that we are. And so there's an unconscious, intuitive seeking for something more real. And it's this movement from head to heart, from noise, thinking mind noise, to silence, that is a movement that needs to establish, happen. It doesn't just happen out of the blue. There's a process that sets in place, and that process is the process of this movement starting to happen. And then once it starts to happen, that process needs to keep repeating and strengthening that resting capacity. A bit like chopping through jungle with a machete. And the more times that we go back and forth on that path, the more well laid out the path becomes, the easier it is to traverse, the more familiar we are with the path and how to move from A to B. And so this movement out of thinking into being becomes much more first nature than it was before. Much more effortless. So peace of mind doesn't come from finding answers to our doubts and our questions, but it comes from the dropping out of the doubts and questions, which are the uncomfortableness. And at first we think, oh, I have a doubt, I need to find an answer. I have a feeling of something missing, so I need to find what is missing. And once it becomes clear that the uncomfortableness or the feeling of something missing is actually contained within this false sense of self, this psychological identity that has been set up and that essentially relates to life through a whole lot of ideas about what it is and what it needs. When it becomes clear that that is the uncomfortableness and that movement can get cut off, when it does start getting cut off, it becomes clear that the peace of mind is not the finding of answers, but the dropping away of questions. Peace of mind is not something that comes when we blame someone and then there is a resolution after the other person admits that they are wrong, but it's the dropping out of the blame. It's a dropping out of the judgment. It's a dropping out of our certainty about how life should be. So a lot of the concepts are there to describe what our structure, our current structure is, that is suffering. So concepts will label suffering and put it into different categories. It will describe what the underlying attitude to the suffering is. So suffering is, in practical terms, guilt for all those actions that have happened through us that have delivered not great outcomes. And then there is this assumption I am the doer of those actions that have led to those outcomes. And given they haven't led to great outcomes, I have to feel inadequate and guilty for not being good enough. guilty for not having functioned, made decisions that would lead to pleasure instead of pain. Guilt is one form of suffering. Blame is based on the same principle of personal doership. I am the doer and therefore you are the doer. And so whenever anyone else acts or functions, behaves, makes decisions that deliver pain to me or someone that I care about, then because we see them as the doer, there is blame. Pride is exactly the same principle of personal doership. And instead of an attitude of personal doership towards outcomes that are painful and deliver less than favorable outcomes, pride is the same attitude of personal doership, but in relation to those actions that happen through us that we see as my doing, my choice, and look what a good choice I made, look how great the outcome is. And we take that outcome as my doing, so I have to claim personal ownership over it, which is what the principle of personal doership is pointing at. So the notion of personal doership is a way of interpreting what causes things to happen. And the personal doership interpretation, or the personal doership attitude, sets in place a me doer and a you doer that is the cause of everything. And so in relation to pride, it says pride comes before the fall. That's not in the teaching, but it's a well-known saying that many people have heard. Pride comes before the fall. And if we understand what it's saying and why it says it, it can help us put a tick next to the concept of personal doership. It says, if you feel proud, it means that there is the belief of personal doership. It means that you see yourself as the reason, the cause, the starting point of a certain outcome. And you're feeling proud as the doer for an outcome that has gone favorably. And because life is a mixed bag and that outcomes are not really in our control, that before not too long, the person that is experiencing a positive outcome is going to experience a negative outcome. And the mechanism by which the negative outcome will happen will be the same as when the mechanism by which the positive outcome happened, which is basically the functioning of the body, making a decision, assessing a scenario, and choosing something that will then deliver an outcome. And time will show the outcomes are not always going to be positive. And so as soon as a negative outcome happens, the system that was able to feel proud based on personal doership is going to crash to the ground and feel the depths of despair, because then the pride will turn into shame or blame. So pride comes before the fall means if you are proud, it won't be long before that pride turns into shame. Now, if pride doesn't exist, which means the internal attitude of personal doership doesn't exist, we're going to function, and sometimes the outcomes are going to be positive. And the attitude will be, yes, I'm functioning like I have always functioned, like everyone else is functioning based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Factors completely out of my control. Two factors, the only two factors that lead to our biological and psychological functioning in life. And so in that moment, a positive outcome, we can appreciate it as a positive outcome. Right? You might design a house You might choose not to use an architect and feel like, okay, I can put my skills to work. I've been searching and looking and figuring out what I like. And you take the risk of designing the house, and then you build the house. And let's say it turns out really well. You can look at it and people can come and see it and they go, wow, this is amazing. Great design. So you know from your own appreciation of the house and from the feedback that others may give you that the outcome is positive. And yet the attitude is, I can be grateful that the outcome was positive, knowing that outcomes are not in my control. I might have thought that I was capable of designing the house. And after I designed it and thought it was good and then built it, I might have realized, oh, it doesn't look very nice. It's not very functional. And so understanding that the outcome is not really in our control, we can be grateful when the outcome is positive. And if it's understood that that was just what this body-mind organism, with its particular genes and up-to-date conditioning, produced, then the pride doesn't exist. The appreciation for the positive outcome is there. And then next week, when the same in principle movement happens, which is the functioning of the body based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, makes a decision and the outcome is not positive, the same principle applies. It's like, yes, I did my best. I functioned according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the outcome, which is not ultimately in my control, turned out to be not so great. And so in neither case is there pride or shame. So that's a conceptual description in the teaching that if awareness starts looking at our own daily life experience, to see these movements of pride happen when they happen. And if there's an investigation of the pride, then we'll see, oh, this is based on a belief in personal doership. And as we see this, ticks can be put next to the concept. And if we also appreciate that the more that happens, the more suffering there is in life. The same with shame and blame, the same with worry and expectation and attachment to outcomes, where we feel that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. And then when an outcome doesn't work out, we are completely invested in defending the outcome, blaming someone for having caused it, thinking that this is diabolical, when in fact, outcomes are much less relevant than we might think they are. So when the psychological self starts to weaken and there is more resting in the silence, and we find that outcomes are much less significant because they're not received by the same psychological entity that received them before. And what we might start appreciating is that the true self is both inside and outside the flow of life. Whereas the psychological identity is completely invested in the flow of life. There is no capacity to feel complete when outcomes are in flux. And life is completely in flux all the time in terms of outcomes. And so the psychological self is inherently uncomfortable. And that is the human condition of suffering. So all the concepts ultimately surely need to be understood by the intellect. But at the end of the day, the movement, that intellectual understanding, is to bring us to silence, to cut off the suffering. Maybe in time, the suffering gets cut off quicker and quicker and quicker until eventually the suffering no longer even arises. And the suffering can get cut off when the understanding is deep and can be delivered through a thought that arises. A very small thought can include in it a whole lot of understanding that has settled and has formed as a result of a whole lot of contemplating and looking and understanding how everything ties in together. And then just a thought that says, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. That might be enough of a reminder that contains so much wisdom that you have seen for yourself based on investigating your own daily life experience. So it seems like a very flat concept. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. But what that contains when it comes up is a depth of appreciation, a depth of seeing beyond the misconception that happiness is to be found in achieving all of things. So as we've investigated and we see time and time again, we get what we would like, and it's pleasurable, but it's not a magic arrow that will eliminate all future suffering. And so eventually it becomes clear, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. That's not what I'm looking for. I've spent a lifetime, we might realize, seeking for happiness in outcomes, only to one day hear what we might have heard many times. Happiness is to be found within, not outside. So searching for outside is the thinking that happens in the thinking mind. The thinking mind that is convinced that it is the doer, that the other is the doer, and that we all need to act perfectly to deliver pleasure, 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 because my happiness will then exist, because outcomes will be pleasure, 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 pleasure. So that's what seeking outwardly is. And the cutting off of that, the dropping into being, is finding the inner happiness, which is not a happiness of outcomes. It's the happiness of self. So I had a couple of interesting talks this week with some people, and I'd like to share a little exploration that came out of the talks, an exploration that might allow for the self that I'm speaking about to be registered in a different context to how it has always been registered when we are looking outward, when we know ourselves as the body. And so one of the paradoxes or ironies of coming to realize the self is that it has always been here in plain sight, more or less. I mean, this is the paradox. It's in plain sight, and yet it can't be seen, so it can't be in plain sight, but it's in plain sight. Sounds like a contradiction. That's what paradox is. And so one of the characteristics of self-realization, not necessarily in the integrated, permanent, unchanging way, but more of awakening process is that this self, this essence, this more true component or aspect of ourself that has been mentioned so often gets appreciated, realized, recognized for the first time. And there's this appreciation. Oh, this is not something new. This is not something that hasn't been here for my whole life, but it just hasn't been appreciated. A bit like the analogy of a fish swimming in water. If it one day realizes the water, in a way, assuming that it spent its life in water, not realizing the water, that in the moment it realizes the water, the realization that the water is realized is significant. It's like, oh, this has never been realized before, and now I realize it. And at that moment of realizing, it says, but it's always been here. And it becomes apparent at that time of realizing that it has always been here. So this little exploration we'll do is a pointer to the I amness that is the essence of all of us. Now, this is an opportune time for me to mention, for those that feel like this resting in being, this dropping out of thinking, this accessing this dimension is significant at this point in time of your journey. In about 9 days' time, I think it's on the 30th of September, Australian time, which would be 29th of September in the US. So Sunday night in the US, Monday in Australia and in Europe, starts the next intensive, the next 6-day online intensive. And that is abiding in I am and witnessing. And a lot of that intensive there'll be more silence, but a significant amount of pointings that are outside of the framework. So the first intensive was the framework. And so this one will have less of the framework and more about looking at daily life from a perspective where we, for the sake of explorations, look at it as not really being real and be much more an arising in consciousness, which allows potentially for a resting in consciousness to happen. As if we're trying to rest in this aspect of ourself while still being heavily identified with form, there's a battle that will prevent the dropping out of form or dropping out of the flow of life into this dimension of being. So a lot of the descriptions that need to be forward to encourage that dimension to open up are descriptions that break our identification with form. And in order for our identification with form to break, there are certain deeply ingrained assumptions that we have. So I'm now going into the exploration that I spoke about. There are certain deeply ingrained assumptions that we have about the nature of life that need to be challenged. And those assumptions are assumptions that have been deeply ingrained because the experience of life as it presents moment after moment for us, not just us as seekers, but us as human beings, the experience, which includes both the outer, what seems like an outer experience, and our thoughts, our memories, and to confirm and tell us that life is a certain way. And unless those assumptions are questioned and put aside, even just temporarily, at least put aside as being absolute truths, unless that happens, then the identification with form, the identification with time and space remains too rigid for a dropping out of the head into the heart to happen. So in this exploration, which will require you to close your eyes and be present with the experience as it exists in that particular moment, we really need to leave everything that we assume to be true behind and put a question mark next to it. So an example of this is, and remember, life is sometimes said to be an illusion, not what it seems. So we've spent a whole lifetime of having an experience that tells us, based on the surface of the experience, that the body is the subject. That the body sees outside of the body and sees what is in the outside world outside of the body. So we've had a whole lifetime of having momentary experience, moment after moment after moment, without appreciating that that is what is happening. And the moment after moment experience is taken to be what is outside of us. It is taken to be what is seen outside of us, what exists outside of us. So when you see, the visual is a large part of any momentary experience. So our whole life is a momentary experience, and the sight objects, the sound objects, the thought objects, and the emotions are a large aspect of the momentary experience. I think the most gross, the most obvious aspect is the visual aspect of the experience. And it's not appreciated to be an experience. It is because it always presents. There is always, let's say, a room that you are in, or a garden, or a city that you find yourself in. There is always an experience of that external world, the room, the garden, the city, the roads. That is always there, and so it is taken to be what is outside of us, and that we are seeing what is outside of us. And so that act, that movement of awareness, the actual seeing, the awareness of the sight objects, what we could call the visual field, isn't appreciated as experience, but it is just taken to be what is outside. I can see what is outside. And so we have this, we also have a very standard and repetitive experience of closing our eyes, and so that experience is an experience of the body closing the eyes. So the subject closes its eyes, and therefore what is outside can no longer be seen. And meditation is let's call it a practice, which is often practiced with eyes closed. And as the practice deepens, it allows us to start to appreciate what we might call an inner world. And if the practice doesn't deepen, then the inner world and a lot of the things that can reveal themselves just don't reveal themselves. And one of the reasons that meditation doesn't always deepen is because of something that I refer to as a residual self-image of yourself and the world. And if in meditation it becomes clear that there is a residual self-image of oneself in the world, if it becomes clear what that residual self-image is of oneself and the world, and as part of that residual self-image becoming clear, there is the capacity, a movement to drop out or to transcend that residual self-image, then the appreciation in that moment can be of something radically different than in the moment before, because the residual self-image was a bit like wallpaper on the inner dimension that was turning the inner dimension into not the inner dimension. It was wallpapering up the inner dimension by bringing in an image of life as we have known it always into the meditation space. So the assumption is that we walk into a room. So if you're looking at me on the screen, it will be a bit confusing, because what I'll be talking about is my inner space, where there, for example, I might be describing there is no body, and you might be looking at the screen, looking at my body. So I suggest that where possible, you close your eyes and follow the prompts rather than looking at the screen, at the body talking to you about there not being a body, because that might be counterproductive. So in meditation, usually, someone walks into a room, sits down, and closes their eyes. Now, if life hasn't ever been described differently, if it hasn't been suggested that life is not as it seems, if it hasn't been suggested that we have deeply ingrained ideas about who we are and what life is, then the individual, the person that is meditating, while the meditation is happening, is the movement inside contains a residual self-image, which means a movement of thought that continues to say, I am a person sitting in a room, on a chair, let's say, in a world of time and space and form. And therefore, any sounds that arise are taken to be sounds happening outside of that residual self-image of myself as a person sitting in a room. And so the whole experience, including sounds and thoughts, are going to have a reference point of the person, the body, as the subject. So the residual self-image says, what is aware of the sound is the body sitting in a room on a chair meditating. Now, that residual self-image is, it's not seen by and large as a belief or a thought, because it has been confirmed by how life presents moment after moment for our whole life. And so the assumption, it's not seen as a belief or a concept. It's taken to be the truth of how life is, that there is a body in a world, and that body is the subject, meaning the body is the center that is aware of everything that happens around it. That gets put in place because that's how life feels. And what that does is it creates the me idea, the me identity. That is what is referred to in some teachings as identification with form. And identification with form really means a deeply ingrained belief assumption that that is how life is, in such a way that there is no appreciation that the experience we have could be something different, or the reason that the appearance happens the way it happens could be because of something different to the assumption I am a body that is the subject in a world of form. And all we're trying to do is crack open a little space where we say it might not be true. I'm not even suggesting that we say that is not true, because that may actually be swinging a little bit too far to the other side. But in the moment that we put aside that being the case, there is a potential for something that hasn't been appreciated for a whole life to be appreciated. So what is suggested is that we focus on the experience as it presents in that moment, and try to see where thoughts and assumptions about what something is creates the impression of it, and how dropping a certain assumption can change the experiential appreciation of the experience. So we sit in meditation. And if you are true to the experience, bring your attention to the current present moment experience, you may realize that there is no room, there is no world of form appearing as it normally does. Now, if the residual self-image is very strong, the assumption is, well, what are you talking about? I've just closed my eyes and the room is still there and the body is still there and I just have my eyes closed. And so then the person might open their eyes to confirm this, and open the eyes open, or what feels like the eyes opens, and the body is there and the room is there. And they say, well, you see, what a ridiculous assumption to say that the room is not there, that the world of form doesn't exist, that there is no body. And if we keep relying on how life appears and how we process what appears, which is what we've been doing our whole life, then we sort of remain in the same cycle. And what might be seen if we just try something different, what may be seen if we try something different doesn't get seen if we stick to the old adage of there is the world of form, I can see it, I'm aware of it, so it's true. Coming inside is really an appreciation that nothing exists outside. Now, don't take these statements of mine to be too absolute. But how about this? Nothing exists outside of our experience. All we know is our experience. So appreciating that there is only an experience ever, and that experience is not the experience that a body is having of an external world, but rather even the body is part of the experience. The body is just part of the visual experience, part of the touch experience. The assumption has always been, I can see the body, and therefore it is an object. I can see the table, and therefore it is an object. But maybe the table is part of the visual experience. The body is also part of the visual experience. And it exists simply as part of a visual experience and not as an objective reality. Now, if we limit that experience to being the visual field, then what we'll tend to do is touch the table. And once the table is experienced through touch, we say, oh, well, now the table is real because I have touched it. But what if sound and touch are also aspects of experience, just like visual is an aspect of experience? So the fact that it is touched and gives feedback, if that is appreciated to be part of the sense of touch, part of the touch experience, that makes up the multi-layered experience of the present moment, we may start to appreciate that the experience has to appear as something. And in this case, it is the appearance of a multi-sensory experience within a framework that is contained in the experience of time and space. So it is an experience of form contained within a framework of time and space. And the form is made up of layers or aspects of experience: sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, and thought forms and emotion forms. And the layering of all of these layers of experience create the final product, the final experience. And it's an experience of a body in a world of form. So when there is sitting in meditation and eyes closed, that might be the radical change of content of the experience. It may not mean that the body has closed its eyes, but it may mean that the experience that was arising, the experience of what we might call the room, the living room, the kitchen, or the garden, that experience vanished and was replaced by different content that we interpret as being eyes closed. And we interpret it as being eyes closed because a residual self-image is brought in to that experience, which means that experience is being created with the residual self-image as part of the experience, meaning the assumption, the thought that is arising, not because anyone is creating it, but because life was designed that way. And so the experience in this moment includes an object of thought that is helpful. And that object of thought, which is a narrative, is what I'm calling the residual self-image, which is the unquestioned assumption that meditation is a person that exists as the subject that lives in a world of form, sitting down with their eyes closed. So the world of form continues to exist as something out there while meditation is happening, which really means the meditation doesn't necessarily get to go very deep. And so if the meditator or the meditation includes a meditator as part of the residual self-image, and as part of the experience, the meditation experience, there is a sound arising, which might be talking. Maybe it's the sound that is assumed to be the sound of the person that sat down next to me when I sat down to meditate in the room. Let's say it was a whole group of people meditating. And the residual self-image is there is a person outside of me moving around or talking. And that might then lead to a frustration and thoughts arising in the meditation that says, if only this person was not making noise, then I would be able to have a deep meditation. So imagine if there is meditation happening and there is the sound of construction happening. And the residual self-image is that of a world outside. And then the construction sound is taken to be sound outside of the person sitting in a room in a building, outside of which there is other people with machinery making noise. So, all truth be told, if the majority of the world population were to listen to what I'm saying now, they'd say, well, yes, that is how it is. And they might also say that Roger is deluded to consider the construction sound as being anything other than sound from outside, sound from something outside of the body, sound being received by the ears. So that is the residual self-image. And it will prevent meditation from delivering or from going where meditation can go. Now, in order for that residual self-image to start to dissolve, start to weaken, there are plenty of these little pointers that need to be added in on top of what I'm currently started to say. So, for example, let's assume that sound, that sight, that seems so much to be dependent on the eyes and the ears, appears like that, but is not like that. That when sound happens, it isn't being heard by the ears. It will appear like that. Life is designed for it to be flawlessly appearing like that. So if you have your eyes open and you put your hands over your eyes, the experience will change such that it will appear to prove that the eyes are what is seeing. And if we keep going based on how life appears, if we keep taking how it appears to be a reflection of truth, we might get stuck in a rigid appreciation of what life is, a limited appreciation of what life is. So I'll take a bit of a sidestep for those that are convinced that the sound of the construction machines or the sound that was heard in meditation that is then labeled to be the sound of construction machines outside, for those that are sure that's what it is, then we'll look at sight, the sight of a table, for example, that is taken on that same principle to be the appreciation of a table outside. I am seeing the table that is outside. We explore that in a way that might make it more clear that it might not be exactly as it seems. And if we can explore that in a way that allows us to see, wow, it seems one way, but it's not that, that can help make us more receptive. So let's agree. I agree. I'm not disputing the fact that when in the present moment experience, the experience feels very much like what is happening is there is a body subject that is aware of a table object. Let's look at the very materialistic view of how sight works. And not only is it a materialistic view, which I'm not saying is wrong. Actually, the materialistic view supports the rather esoteric notion I'm putting forward that there is nothing outside of us. At least none of our experience is outside of us. And ironically, we think the materialistic view confirms that there is something outside of us, and we're going to get to use the materialistic view to hopefully see that there is nothing outside of us, that everything is inside of us, which is not at all as it appears. So the materialistic view says that light bounces off an object, is reflected into the eyes, which are a lens essentially. The light is reflected off the object and therefore creates a reflection of the object in the eyes. And one of the important things is that in that materialistic science of how the vision of an object outside gets registered by the eyes, because the eyes are a lens and the light is a reflection, it is effectively an inverse image that hits the eye, an inverse image of the object, because it is a reflection of the object, a reflection of light off the object. So it arrives on the lens of the eye as an inverse to what is actually finally registered as the sight experience. Now, that's a very important component of us appreciating beyond what appears to us, because what appears to us is what we have taken to be the truth of the matter. And what appears to us is the table is outside of that which is aware of it. The experience says that the experience of the table is something outside of that which is aware of it. So the light has bounced off the object and has entered the eye as an inverse, meaning not as we end up appreciating the object, image. The materialistic explanation of how sight works then says that the eye transmits that data into the brain as electrical signals, and the brain crunches that data and produces a new set of information that it sends to the mind. So where does the image of the table happen? According to materialistic science, the image of the table arises inside the mind. Now, the mind doesn't pick up or doesn't receive the table. The mind receives all of the data that is hitting the eye at the same time, which is all of the light bouncing off all of the objects, arising in the mind, in the eye as an inverse image of the what we might call the external world, i.e., the world of objects that the light is bouncing off. And so that whole image is received by the eyes, in inverse form, flipped by the brain. So that inverse form is converted into electrical signals, flipped the right way round and projected onto the mind. And when it projected onto the mind, it appears in the mind, which is the experience that we have only ever had. So the experience that you are having right now of what you might call objects is happening inside the mind. But the experience that is created inside the mind is an experience of a body because the light is bouncing off the body as well as off the table. And so the experience that arises in the mind is of a body looking at a table. So that construction sound that was heard is in principle the same as the visual of the table. It is sound waves received by the ears according to the materialistic science. The ears then communicate that, transmit that to the brain. The brain processes that and projects it onto mind. And what we end up hearing is the modulation of what is transmitted after the sound is sent to the brain, and the brain processes it and sends it to the mind. Just like after the eye sends the information to the brain processes it and sends it to the mind, all of which as a single multi-layered sensory experience. And the thoughts about the table are happening in the same place, ultimately are being experienced in the same place in the mind. The brain, let's say, produces the thoughts and sends those along with the visual and the sound, and it becomes part of the momentary experience in such a way that it appears that the thinking is happening by that object, the body, in that appearance in the mind. So what seems to be the experience of an external world, an experience that seems to have on the surface of it nothing to do with mind and brain and electrical signals, is very different from what it appears, according to materialistic science. So I'm taking the use of the materialistic explanation because most assumptions about what life is, being an experience outside of me, is based on an assumption of a materialistic world. And so if I used an esoteric explanation to show that things are not as they seem, the materialist, i.e. that person who is experiencing the world as a materialistic world, will say, but you're bringing in some mystical assumption of how things work, whereas I don't believe in that. I believe in a world of materialism. So as not to allow that sort of escape route to be there, I sooner describe it from a materialistic point of view and still demonstrate that things are not as they seem, even from a materialistic point of view. So if we close our eyes again, maybe appreciating that both the daily life experience, which is really the experience that is the experience that appears to be the eyes open experience, both that experience and what we can call the eyes closed experience, which hopefully some of you are starting to appreciate might not be anything to do with eyes opening and closing, but rather due to content in mind changing radically. In the meditation space, we might, if some of these deeply ingrained assumptions about the reality of life and how life is get challenged, we might be able to attention might come to that space and appreciate the content as it is in the meditation space without the residual self-image or residual world image. So that might mean bringing attention to what, with the residual self-image, we might still be calling the back of our eyelids or the bridge of our nose. Bring attention to what we might be thinking as that. And if we focus on the visual field with what we're calling eyes closed, you might realize there's this vast visual emptiness. You can actually see it without any eyes. And it's being seen not from the perspective of a body. You might even appreciate that what is seeing it is that vast emptiness. That there isn't a separate subject seeing the emptiness. If there is a separate subject, it's most likely the residual self-image. There might be the appreciation that in the absence of the residual world image, there is no space and time as previously existed, no walls, no lines, no 3 or 4 or 2 dimensions. Any objects that exist are very, very likely objects of thought being projected into that space. Now, if the residual self-image is there, we're still imagining ourselves as a body sitting on a chair with eyes closed in a room. But if that has started to loosen and there is an appreciation of just the experience as it's arising, where we say, this is all there is, at least as far as the experience goes, your experience goes. You know, the residual self-image, if it's there, will take a rather indistinct sensation of touch and project onto it what that sensation is. It'll create the chair in the world of the room, and then create the image of thighs touching the chair, and place a whole body sitting on the chair. So we'll use the slightest sensation and turn it into what it thinks it is based on an assumption of the past, instead of being completely present. Sure, there's some indistinct sensation, but what if we don't add on the residual self-image? Maybe then it just becomes indistinct sensation arising in that vast spaciousness. So if the residual self-image is there and I say, so are you still there? Then going to the experience, I would go, of course I'm still here. I feel I'm sitting on the chair and I know I am here. I feel like I am here because I am here. Now, if some of you are present with that vast spaciousness, appreciating the experience as it arises, you might appreciate there is no body. There is no visual of a human body. There is no very defined sense of touch of the human body, maybe some indistinct senses of sensation, touch sensation. But most importantly, recognize there is no physical body as you usually know it. And then I ask you, and are you here? And even without the body, it's very clear to you, well, yes, I'm here. Now we assume that that sense of I am here is because and linked to the body. But what if that sense of I am here that is very evident to everyone in the meditation, so much so that it is so easily assumed I am here and the body is still here and all that. What if that sense of I am here is a very particular component of the momentary experience? Maybe that's the component referred to as I am. The I am that exists prior to the body. Just as a sense, no need, no thinking about what I am. If there is a thinking about what I am, it probably means the residual self-image is, what is that? But if attention has landed on the undeniable sense, even in this world of no form, if attention has landed on that undeniable sense I am, then maybe we're a step closer to knowing that which is pointed at so vigorously, pointed out to be such a essential realization of who we really are. An identification with form, identification with the body is the act of assuming unquestioningly that the sense of I am stems from a body. You can close your eyes, or at least what we call close your eyes, can happen anytime. That means at any time, a dropping into the formless world, the dimension of no form, can happen. And you'll always be there. But what you find is you or I in that world of form is a much less personal I, a much less defined I. It's not a me of characteristics, of preferences, of gender, of age. It's not a I that or a me that requires the world to see it a certain way. It's not an I or a me that requires achievements. This is the sense of existence that exists prior to any judgment or thinking of who we are. This is sometimes referred to coming home. And maybe just one of you or two of you tonight have found the portal that wasn't available before. And that is like hacking one's way through the jungle. And if over the next week closing eyes, what appears to be closing eyes happens, the dropping into the formless can happen over and over again until such time as it is effortless and known to be the depths of who you are. And resting in that undeniable sense of I am, not I am this or that, or I am Roger, or I am male or female, or I like this and that. But the undeniable I am prior to form is where silence of the mind can happen. That is the I that is unaffected by the flow of life. the I that doesn't have an opinion on the flow of life, because this I is on the formless dimension. And on the formless dimension, there is no flow of life. So if in meditation, which is really the resting in the formless, there is a narrative about the world of form, the residual self-image coming in, arising within the formless space. Now, we don't get to live our life as a human being in the formless. When opening eyes happen, we're back into the world of form, but the world of form might not be as devoid of formlessness as we may have come to experience it as. And so dwelling in the formless world may allow for that formlessness to be seen in the form, may allow for a resting in the I am to happen simultaneous to the apparent form existing. And as that integrates, what it translates into is that we get to live as the human being, as if the world is a world of form, at peace, because our sense of self is not completely identified with the outside, but rather has started to see the world of form arising inside. So abiding in I am, I suggest, needs to start in the world of the formless, which really is a meditation with eyes closed. Maybe appreciating where the residual world image, the residual sense of self is coming in and creating a world of form inside what can easily be the formless. And as that is seen, that will happen less and less. And so we get to ground and abide in I am. The sense I am here is very strong, but there is no body. And that's why we might miss this sense of I am, even in meditation where it's very strong, because we assume, oh yes, I am because the body is sitting in a room. But if we see in our experience, is there a room? Is there a body? There isn't. And yet I am. Abide in that. Abide as that. Be that. There's a story of these South Indian sages, two brothers. And the older brother was the guru for the younger brother. And at some point, the younger brother had his realization of self, the nature of life. And he asked his brother to bury him alive. And his brother, who was his guru, obliged and buried him alive. So in the younger brother, the realization manifested as there is really no point to live any longer. The formless was seen to be such that death made sense. But let's not mistake that as being the only expression of the realization. In the case of the brother who was the guru for this, that enlightened sage didn't see that as being the required culmination of his realization, and yet he was happy to oblige his brother's request because he understood how it can make sense. And yet it doesn't have to be the only expression or the only logical next step. Far from it. There are many sages, in fact, probably more, many more, that after liberation, the movement is you have to live as the human being. That is what this experience of life is. So the Zen tradition seems to be the one that includes integration of non-duality the most of the non-dual traditions, in that the Zen tradition, after seeing the non-dual ness, the experience, the transitory nature of life, the impermanence of life, the formlessness of life, it's that tradition that tends to tell us to come back and live as if form is the reality. Before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. Another Zen saying pointing at this is, before liberations, mountains and rivers were seen as real. During the process of liberation, or during the process of enlightenment, mountains and rivers were seen to be unreal. That's the awakening. After enlightenment, mountains and rivers were real again. A lot of Advaita tends to focus on the awakening and doesn't include that much of the integration. It's there. But there is, just like we could say, a lot of Zen and Buddhism talks about before awakening and is quite dualistic, because some seekers will only be able to hear that. Then there is the non-dual aspect of Buddhism, and then there is the integration of the Zen tradition, and it can be seen elsewhere in Buddhism. Advaita tends to focus on the awakening, the oneness, the duality, and not so much of the integration. And that's not because one is better than the other. It's that they're all doing their own specific jobs. There's no point talking about integration before the awakening. There's no point talking about awakening if the seeker isn't ripe enough to awaken. And so all of these different teachings are as valid as each other, because they're all dealing with seekers, at different shaped seekers. When we look at the framework, that is the framework I put forward and that Ramesh kindly brought into this world, it talks about our attachment to outcomes, our conviction that happiness is to be found in form. And when we look at a lot of religion, which to me is part of the spiritual teachings, religion will talk to its audience. And because that belief of doership and attachment to outcome is so strong and won't resonate with something that is too far away from its design, the religions will play to that. And so we can appreciate that the notion of heaven, the notion of what is the Islam equivalent, or the jihad, I think it's jihads, I don't know, I'll probably get myself in trouble. They are happy to die because they will have their 50 virgins or 99 virgins. And same in Christianity, the heaven is going to deliver all sorts of pleasures. And so that is just catering to a seeker that is at a certain place. And as that teaching delivers its goodness as best it can, the seeker changes, and then it is ready for something more and more and more. And the more and more is essentially more and more dissolution, dissolving of the rigid identity. And as that rigid identity dissolves, there is less attachment to outcomes, less personal doership, more access to the formless, where life is appreciated as an experience. We recognize that each night in deep sleep, the experience comes to an end, and there is absolutely never any problems for anyone in deep sleep. And maybe the appreciation that at some point the story comes to a complete end for the person, even the liberated person that has to continue living life as it presents. At some point, death is the end of the experience of life. And if we appreciate the experience, we say the end of the experience is the absence of experience. And our experience of the absence of experience, which is not really an experience we can have, but we at least know that there is no problem in deep sleep when there is no world, when there is no person, when there isn't even a sense of I am. To the ego, that notion of death being the end, if the ego is of a certain structure, is absolutely non-palatable. It is too challenging to that sense of, so we stick an idea of more lives, reincarnation, souls, heaven, so that the ego can relax. It's okay, you'll carry on. You'll live another life. You'll go to another world. And as the ego gets weaker and weaker, that becomes less and less needed. And then we might just realize, oh, life is the experience, and who cares when there is no experience? We say, who cares? Because our sense of self needing to achieve something, get somewhere, dissolves, and it's just about life and experience. And in that, becomes very clear that it is the uncomfortableness in life that is part of that ego existence, or that identity. And as that identity dissolves, life is still there, but it's free of the suffering. So it's just, and that's why we can say, well, life is experience and it will come to an end. And who cares?